That's why I think Christian nationalism is so dangerous, is we conflate our faith with our citizenship as Americans, and we can actually replace God's messianic force in the world rather than it being the church and, Jesus as the center of everything. It can turn towards America, and we create sort of an Americanized Messiah and an Americanized gospel with its own, doctrines of manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery and, this kind of blessing of Israel as if Israel can do no wrong. And I think that's really dangerous theology that begins to get in the way of our fidelity to Christ.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. Today I'm joined by someone that I don't align with politically in many areas, but Shane Claiborne and I share something much deeper in politics. We both believe that Christians must obey God rather than men, and we believe there are moments where civil disobedience is not optional, but it's actually a duty that Christians hold. So where a lot of podcasts would focus on friction or differences, etc., I think it's more important that we focus on the ground we share, where we both want to obey God, and we just maybe differ on where the line of injustice draws, but I think that's what makes this conversation worthwhile. Shane Claiborne is an activist, he's an author, he's a Christian speaker. He is well known for his work with the poor, his public advocacy for nonviolence, his willingness to challenge both the church and state when he believes the gospel requires it. He's founded The Simple Way. He's a co-founder of Red Letter Christians in Philadelphia. And he is just committed to serving the marginalized that are out there. This is someone who also has not done just civil disobedience in theory. He has been arrested for feeding and sheltering homeless. He has traveled to Iraq during U.S. wartime sanctions. And he's even led public demonstrations melting guns into garden tools. He's written a ton of books. So Shane, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thanks for the conversation, and not something I get to talk about every day. So I'm glad to be with you, man. Thanks.
Well, good. I appreciate it. So, all right, before we get into anything here, what does conviction mean at the most biblical level, to you? Where do you see conviction leading in this area?
Well, my first allegiance, my fidelity and loyalty is to Jesus. And I also think the good litmus test for that is love. Love of neighbor, love God. That's what Jesus says over and over. All everything is summed up into this: love God and love people. So there are times when our governments and our policies don't stand on the side of love and flourishing and compassion. And that's where, I think our job is to stay loyal to God's call to love our neighbor, to care for the poor and most vulnerable. And Jesus is really my moral compass on that. And when it comes to good trouble and holy mischief, I don't think it gets much better than Jesus.
No, that's true. That's true. So, but you and I might disagree probably on the definition of love and how we look at it. I can love my wife, love my dog, but I'm not going to put my wife outside to go to the bathroom, So I know there's different definitions of it, but civil disobedience, on the other hand, there has to be a criteria on it, because I can take love as my criteria and really kind of take it to all extremes in all situations and all, especially if I base it off of a feeling. So how do you use the criteria to determine when to engage in civil disobedience and when not to engage in civil disobedience?
The interesting thing is that the early church was wrestling with this, right? As they, many of them went to jail as they were navigating conflicting allegiances to Jesus and to Caesar. And in Acts, it says that these folks are troublemakers. They're creating trouble all over the empire, and now they've come here. They're claiming loyalty to an emperor other than Caesar, and that was Jesus, and that was everything that captivated their attention. So I think when we look at Jesus, I believe that Jesus is the full revelation of God. This is God become flesh, and this is who we follow. And so when I look at things like the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, they reorient our life. They reorient the way we think about possessions. They reorient how we think about the ways that we treat those who are marginalized, and the way that we um, find ourselves in the belly of empires and governments that can, I think, at times be an instrument of flourishing and of God's love, and at other times they stand in the way of that. So I think that's why we see prophets and Christians throughout history that were jailed, that were called enemies of the state. I mean, we look at Moses, his birth was an act of civil disobedience. So was Jesus's. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refusing the royal orders and going in the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the king's court, but not drinking the king's Kool-Aid. I mean, the prophets are a rich history where Jeremiah was jailed, John the Baptist was beheaded, John of Patmos that wrote Revelation was exiled. So their fidelity is to God first. And that's where, I think I kind of sometimes like to change the language of civil disobedience to divine obedience. Because it's not just that we're against something, we're not out to get arrested, but our goal is to be faithful to Jesus and to be faithful to loving our neighbor, even when our governments and policies get in the way of that.
So I got to ask this question based off of that, because like when I look at Martin Luther King and I look at Gandhi or or Mandela, and in his later years, obviously not when he first started, part of the way they were bringing attention to the matter was to be arrested. The way they brought attention to it was they recognized that the only way that they could uh, be ambassadors for what they believed in. For us, we're ambassadors for Christ, but was to be arrested, was to have some of these things that almost point out what we are against. And I know you've quoted before that it's kind of sad that I'm paraphrasing, but it's sad that we're thought of as what we're against instead of what we're for. And you've kind of mentioned it just then. But isn't part of the idea of being civil disobedience to point people to God so that they can look at it and say, if you're willing to do this for God, he must be real. Isn't there something kind of bigger in that regard?
Well, absolutely. When I look at folks like Dr. Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement, these are folks that have shaped my imagination, on what it looks like to bear witness in public of God's love and compassion. They're folks that I take a lot of cues from. And one of the things that Martin Luther King said is that the church is not meant to be the master of the state, nor is it meant to be the servant of the state, but the church is meant to be the conscience, right? This kind of holy prophetic conscience of our nation. And I think particularly, Peter, right now, I mean, our nation is in need of a moral conscience, of voices of compassion. And one of the ways that Dr. King saw that we do that is through nonviolent direct action, through exposing injustice so that it becomes uncomfortable for those in power, so that they have to respond. So there's a lot of ways that I've participated in that kind of spirit of nonviolent direct action. I mean, some of the earliest times that we got arrested in Philadelphia was simply for feeding people who were on the streets. And our city was passing anti-homeless laws, laws that discriminated against folks on the street. Over 50 cities around the country have done that now. And so it was literally illegal to get a pizza and give it out downtown in Philadelphia. And those were the things that we were fined for and eventually arrested for. And we went to jail, and we made our case. And in many cases, and we went to trial many times, but, in some of these, they went all the way to a federal court where we argued that this was our religious freedom, that this was not only a biblical right, but it's also a constitutional right. And that to say that we cannot feed someone who's homeless is a violation of our religious freedom, because we believe when we're feeding someone who's hungry, not only are we feeding a fellow human being, but we're also feeding Christ in disguise, that this is sacramental, it's holy, and it goes to the very heart of our faith. And similarly, now I think there are many Christians that see welcoming refugees or immigrant families, that this is a part of their religious freedom, and there's a rich tradition of being able to seek sanctuary in church spaces. So that's why we see, lawsuits right now between the church and the federal government over safe spaces and being able to care for refugees and immigrant families. And that's had a lot of different iterations for me, Peter, over the years. But when we went to Iraq, as you mentioned, during the war in 2003, this was just as bombs were starting to fall on Baghdad. It was in response to 9/11 and, the tragic violence of the attacks on 9/11. And I went to Iraq. But one of the things that we did as we tried to stand against the retaliation and war was we took medication. And we took basic medical supplies, and technically that was illegal. And we faced up to 10 years in jail for taking medication to Iraq. But our faith is what fuels that, right? I mean, literally our scripture says, if your enemy is hungry, feed them. If your enemy is thirsty, give them something to drink. So there is a higher law than the sanctions or the laws and policies of our government. And for me, that authority is Christ and Scripture.
So, is there a danger though, and is there a danger though that your cause can become your idol, where you can lose sight of the idea? And I've seen that. We talked about civil rights. I've seen that with a lot of members of the civil rights movement as they have progressed in different ways. Seems like they have lost the idea of that. Again, we're pointing to God, we're pointing to what God has called us to do, and now has pointed to these political issues or social issues, and has almost made that an idol in replace of God. Is there a danger to that? And have you personally kind of seen that or experienced that yourself?
There's always a need to keep ourselves grounded in love and in faith. But as my brother Dr. Cornell West says, justice is what love looks like in public. So I think it's important to be public about our love and to stand against the policies and laws that discriminate and crush the lives of our neighbors. So, like I said, I think the important thing is for us, the goal is never to get arrested. We're not out to just to create trouble for no reason, but our goal is to bear witness of God's love. So, like, one of the things that we did against the anti-feeding ordinances was we served communion, and we had a worship service, and many of our friends living on the street came to that. And then, after serving communion, we were arrested during those services and that witness. But it gave us an opportunity to put the laws on trial and to really argue our case before a court. And we had a judge that seemed very sympathetic. And he actually made the point that if it weren't for people who broke the bad laws, we wouldn't have the freedom that we have. That's what this country's built on, from the Boston Tea Party, an act of civil disobedience, to the civil rights movement and the Underground Railroad. So he argued, that we were not criminals, we were freedom fighters, and we need to break the bad laws just as much as we need to obey the good ones. And there's, certainly a case to be made from Romans and other verses about respecting the authorities. But part of what we do, Peter, is I think we publicly suffering the consequences of our faithfulness to Christ and our inability to be complicit with these unjust laws is to go to court and to go to jail and suffer the consequences. That's one way that we can pay respect to the state, is by openly suffering the consequences for disobeying the bad laws. But it's important that there's a hundreds and hundreds of year old history, especially for Christians in this, that Augustine said an unjust law is no law at all. And for many, many years, Christians were victims of state violence. They were persecuted. They were locked up in jail. So that's why when Dr. Martin Luther King, when he first went to jail, he said, it disturbed me at first, but then I looked at history and saw what good company I have.
Right. But okay, so I'm gonna take a little bit of history and bring it into modern times. So before the Revolutionary War, there was really two main types of pastors. There was the Black Robe Regiment, who was talking about freedom, in that group, and then there was loyalists who were talking about being loyal to the king. And I believe that there's probably pastors on both sides that we will see in heaven later, and there are probably people on both sides that we will not on it from there. Is it possible that we look at today and we're looking at people that have theological differences with you or with, on maybe with an idea of immigration or with, gun control or whatever the situation happens to be? Is it possible that when you look at both sides of this, that there is a way to find even common ground through a theological perspective, that you and I can agree on certain areas, especially from a Christian perspective, but maybe not agree with it on a political perspective? And if that's the case, how do we reconcile that among
Mhm.
Christians?
Well, so there's a lot in that question, and part of it is I think that it's God's job to sort out, who's faithful and who are true followers of Christ. I mean, it is significant that Jesus's final account of the judgment in Matthew 25 is not just a theological test that will be asked, okay, virgin birth, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. It's not going to just be who we voted for in elections or something, but the questions that we will be asked by God, according to Jesus, are, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was a stranger, did you welcome me? When I was sick, did you make sure I had health care? Did you take care of me? So what we do to the least of these, we do to Christ. And again, I think that's part of what should fuel everything that we do, is our love for Jesus and our concern for the most vulnerable people among us. And that's what fuels so much of our work. And when I look at history and the Underground Railroad and the bus boycotts, Rosa Parks civil disobedience, the sit-ins at in the restaurants, these were fueled by a love for justice and concern for all people. And there are many iterations, I think, that's had internationally around the world, but it's our love that fuels it. It's our hunger for freedom for everyone. And I think of a scripture that talks about that in Corinthians, where it says, where one part of the body suffers, we all suffer with it. And so one way that we can stand in solidarity with those who suffer is by doing these kind of acts of courageous, civil disobedience and nonviolent direct action. But the point is always to center God's love and God's justice for the vulnerable. And Martin Luther King ruffled feathers. So I think, one of his really powerful speeches that's not very well known, but he gave this, wrote this speech when he was 27 years old, I think, and in 1956, and it's called The Obnoxious Peace. And I would offer, Peter, that as a framework for this, because he talked about how peace can become obnoxious, and that we shouldn't just want the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And he wrote that speech, incidentally, after a case in Alabama where this courageous young woman, authoring Lucy, had integrated the University of Alabama as the first Black woman to go to school there. And white folks got mad. They rioted, they gave death threats. And so sadly, the response of the University of Alabama was to kick her out of the school. And so she was expelled from the school, and the newspapers in Alabama read, finally, there is peace again in Alabama. And that's what Dr. King called the obnoxious peace. And he said, if peace is just keeping our mouths shut and in the midst of injustice, I don't want it. If it's being, adjusted to injustice, we shouldn't want that kind of peace. So there's sort of a counterfeit peace that the devil can offer that I think is very different from the peace that's liberating and life affirming that God offers. So true peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And that's a great lesson of Dr. King, I think, to all of us, especially in a time right now where we kind of want to all hug and get along, but certainly unity can become an idol if it gets in the way of truth telling and really of love. We don't just want a false unity or an obnoxious peace. We want the real thing.
All right. So, in looking at it from the perspective of, yeah, and I don't want a singular focus. So I'm kind of having a hard time figuring out how to ask this question. But a lot of the policies of taking care of the disadvantaged, in different ways, if they became a government program, at that point in time, is there a risk that we start relying on the government instead of relying on the church? Is it risking silencing the church in a way when we have those type of programs? I think of I believe it was Piven and Cloward who when they wrote that it was, when Bismarck saw that socialism, communism was happening, they put out the welfare state in order to lower it down. I think FDR had the same type of principle. So when I look at that, is there a possibility that would silence the church whenever we as the church aren't taking care of the disenfranchised, but we're forcing the government to do so, or asking the government to do so? What are your
I
thoughts on
don't
that?
think that this is an either or, Peter. My thought on it is that there's room for generosity and compassion no matter who we are. We need the church standing up, and we need politicians to stand up. And I do think we exist in a world where there are a lot of false binaries where we've got to choose either or. And thankfully, I think the conversation that you're inviting us into holds some tensions. And I would say Matthew 25 would not only says that each of us as individuals will be judged, but all of the nations will be judged by how we care for the least of these. So politicians are not exempt. Governments are not exempt. Our leaders, our political leaders and legislators are not exempt from trying to advocate for the most vulnerable. And that doesn't mean that the church is impotent. I think we should all be trying to figure out how to make sure everyone has the best health care and education that they can have. I've been a part of a medical collective where Christians pull money together to meet each other's medical bills every month. That's not the solution for millions of people. I think we need more of that type of thing. But I also think there are so many other ways that our government has a responsibility to provide for everyone. And things like making sure folks have housing should be something we're all running after with our whole heart. And this is why it's also connected to military spending and the war budget. And I'm optimistic that conservatives and liberals, I don't really like those titles, but that all of us that care about people flourishing can say, let's stop pulling money out of the sky for bombs and wars, and let's make sure that our children have like our school here doesn't even have air conditioning, so it has to release when it gets too hot for the kids. And there's that old bumper sticker that it'll be a good day when the military has to have a bake sale to buy a warplane, and our kids have everything they need. So I think that these priorities of should be defined by love and by our fidelity to Christ. And according to Jesus, our nation will not be judged on how the Dow Jones is doing and how the billionaires are doing, but how the most vulnerable, the least of these, are doing in our society. So the real measure of the character of our nation is how we're caring for the most vulnerable people. And that's why I'm so concerned right now. I've been a part of the Poor People's Campaign and other marches and vigils where we were actually arrested in the Capitol for praying. As cuts were being made and folks were poised to lose some of their food subsidies and health care. And one of those young folks was in a wheelchair and communicated through a tablet. And if he loses his health care, I think the church can do much, but we also need the government to be faithful to make sure that people are cared for too. So, yeah, I think it's all the above, man. And that's why it should be the moral compass of legislators to say, things like welcoming refugees and immigrants. This is not a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. This is a Jesus thing, and it's a love thing. And to make it plain, Peter, some of our highest numbers of refugees and immigrants and asylum seekers have come under Republican presidents, as you probably know. Some of our lowest numbers have come under the current president. And I think we can do better to make sure, as a starting point, folks like DACA recipients, young people that many of them have gone to colleges and started businesses, and some haven't even lived in the countries where their parents immigrated from. Let's make sure they have a path to citizenship. Let's make sure that we don't just care for the persecuted Christians overseas in Syria and not welcome them to find a different life and a different future for their kids and families here. And not just Christians. I think we should have compassion on all people, but that should be the real bar of how we care for the least of these. And Scripture's so clear that when we welcome the foreigner, we might be entertaining angels unaware. That when we welcome the stranger, we should treat them as they were our own flesh and blood, because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt. So it's a constant thread from, Old Testament to New, that we should care for the foreigner, the immigrant, the widows and orphans, the refugees. And that's why, I think the framework for this is just a culture war between liberals and liberals and conservatives is really unfair. And we should have a bigger heart of compassion that transcends partisan politics.
Hey, folks, today's conversation with Shane has taken us through the heart of what civil disobedience has meant for Christians across history, from the Hebrew midwives to Daniels to the apostles to Dr. Martin Luther King. We have seen where Christians have found themselves standing against the powers of their time. And Shane doesn't treat it as distant history. He actually lives them out. But as you also heard, this is where the part of our next conversation becomes harder. Since Christians share the commitment to obey God, we need to now look at it for more modern applications. And this is where our conversation becomes even more revealing, not because we fight, but because we continue to walk together even when the path begins to separate. I will also talk about, at the very end of our conversation, I'm going to talk about some of the parts where we do disagree, and we will do that. So I look forward to seeing you for episode 2 of this conversation with Shane Claiborne.